This story is a fictional narrative created from speculation, incomplete accounts, and interpretations that were never officially verified. They say the object didn't move like anything people were used to seeing. Not fast, not slow, just deliberate. Those who noticed it first described a metallic shape suspended above the night sky, reflecting light in a way that felt wrong. Too clean, too controlled. No sound followed it. No trail, no flicker. Just a presence that made people stop mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-thought. And then, almost as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. What remained was confusion, unease, and a question no one knew how to ask without sounding ridiculous. Hours later, or perhaps earlier, depending on which fragment you believe, a military sergeant was found unconscious in a swimming pool inside a restricted compound. Not floating peacefully, not struggling, just there, motionless, as if placed. They say the water was cold. They say there were no signs of forced entry, no alarms triggered, no witnesses who could agree on what they'd seen. Some insist the pool lights were still on. Others swear they were off, the body illuminated only by reflected moonlight. What unsettled people most wasn't the discovery itself, it was the timing. Because the sergeant had been seen earlier that night, alert, focused, completely normal. And yet, when he was pulled from the water, his breathing was shallow, his pulse erratic, his expression frozen in something that didn't resemble fear or peace. It looked like interruption, as if consciousness had been cut mid-thought. When he eventually opened his eyes, if the accounts are accurate, he didn't ask where he was. He asked how long he'd been gone. And when no one answered him clearly, he stopped asking questions altogether. That was the first silence. More would follow. There are places where stories aren't supposed to exist. Restricted zones, controlled environments, spaces designed to remove ambiguity through procedure and discipline. And yet, those are often the places where ambiguity grows best. Quietly, carefully, protected by routine. This story, depending on who tells it, began on a night that wasn't supposed to be memorable. No alerts, no exercises, no anomalies scheduled or anticipated. Just a stretch of time meant to pass unnoticed. Until it didn't. Some versions suggest the metallic object was seen by civilians far beyond the compound. Others insist it was only visible from certain angles, at certain moments, as if it chose who could notice it. No consensus ever forms. Only overlapping impressions that refuse to align. What everyone agrees on is this: something disrupted the pattern. And patterns matter in places built on control. The sergeant, whose name is never spoken the same way twice in retellings, was not known for imagination, not prone to speculation, not the kind of person who embellished stories for attention. That detail appears in nearly every version, as if people need to establish credibility before approaching the impossible. After the incident, he didn't volunteer explanations. He withdrew. If you're drawn to stories like this, stories that live in the space between secrecy and uncertainty, subscribe to the channel. These are the restricted narratives that resist closure. And while you're here, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Distance has a strange way of changing how these stories feel. Because what followed the discovery of that unconscious body wasn't an investigation in the usual sense. It was containment and silence. The first thing people noticed was the gap, not a dramatic one. Not the kind that triggers alarms or immediate suspicion. Just a quiet inconsistency in time that didn't fit the rhythm of the night. The sergeant had last been seen walking across the compound grounds earlier than expected. Alone. Hands behind his back. Head slightly tilted, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Some say he paused near the pool. Others insist he had no reason to be there at all. The pool itself was unremarkable, functional, rarely used, maintained more out of protocol than enjoyment. Its surface that night was perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a sheet of dark glass. When he was found, there were no splashes recorded, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle. His uniform was damp but intact, clinging to him in a way that suggested immersion without motion. They pulled him out quickly, not because of panic, but because procedure demanded it. As his body hit the concrete, water spilling from fabric and boots, someone noticed his hands. They were clenched, not in fists, in a shape that looked like he'd been holding something small, something that wasn't there anymore. When he regained consciousness, slowly, unevenly, he didn't thrash, he didn't gasp. He inhaled once, sharply, like someone returning from a depth they hadn't planned to reach. His eyes opened, and then narrowed. He scanned faces with the intensity of someone trying to orient themselves inside a room that had subtly changed shape. "How long?" he asked. No one answered immediately, because no one knew. The clocks disagreed. Logs contradicted each other. What should have been a short window stretched or compressed, depending on which record you trusted. It wasn't missing time in the dramatic sense. It was misaligned time. When someone finally told him an estimate, his expression shifted. Not into relief, but into calculation. "That's not possible," he said quietly. Not defensive, not emotional, certain. They asked him what he remembered. He shook his head once. "I remember being somewhere else," he said. "But not leaving." That statement circulated later, stripped of context, repeated with emphasis on different words depending on who told it. Some highlighted somewhere else. Others focused on not leaving. He didn't elaborate. Over the following hours, if hours is the right word, he complied with every request. Sat where he was told, answered what he could, signed where instructed, but something in him had changed its orientation. He no longer looked outward. He looked inward, as if monitoring something just beneath the surface. At one point, someone asked him about the sky, whether he'd seen anything unusual. The sergeant paused longer than necessary, then said, "I didn't look up." That answer raised more questions than it resolved. Because several witnesses, reliable ones, depending on which version you believe, claimed they had seen him looking straight up earlier that night, standing perfectly still, face illuminated by something that wasn't there anymore. When he was finally allowed to rest, he didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, fingers occasionally curling and uncurling like they were relearning their own instructions. Later, when asked why he hadn't tried to swim, he responded with something that would trouble people for years. "I wasn't underwater," he said, and when pressed to explain what he meant by that, he closed his eyes and refused to continue. They say the compound returned to normal too quickly. That detail bothers people when they reflect on it later, not because order was restored, but because it never truly broke. The routines resumed as if the night had been a minor interruption rather than a fracture. Lights followed schedules, guards changed shifts, conversations lowered themselves back into acceptable ranges. Only one thing remained out of rhythm: the sergeant. He was cleared to remain on site, though not in his usual quarters. The room he was given was spare, neutral, stripped of personal markers, a place meant for temporary occupancy, not recovery. He didn't protest. He sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting flat on his thighs, eyes unfocused. Those who checked on him later would say he looked like someone waiting for instructions that weren't coming. When questioned again, gently this time, he was cooperative, but distant. His answers came after pauses, as if they passed through an internal filter before reaching his mouth. "What do you remember before the pool?" someone asked. He thought. "I remember the air feeling thin," he said. "Not like altitude, like attention." No one knew how to record that. Another question followed. "Did you hear anything?" He shook his head, then corrected himself. "Not sound. Pressure." That word appeared again and again in later retellings. Pressure without weight, presence without contact. When asked about the object in the sky, he didn't deny it. He said, "I didn't see it from below." That answer unsettled the room more than a simple yes or no. "From where, then?" someone asked. The sergeant's jaw tightened. His fingers curled slightly, then relaxed. "I don't think where works the way you're using it," he replied. After that, the questions slowed. Not because curiosity faded, but because something unspoken entered the room. A shared sense that continuing might destabilize something delicate. Whatever the sergeant was holding inside himself felt fragile, as if language itself might damage it. Later that night, or what passed for night, the pool was drained. Officially, this was routine maintenance. Unofficially, it was an attempt to erase the most visible reminder of the incident. As the water receded, those present noticed something unusual at the bottom. Not damage, not residue, just marks, faint impressions along the tiles, forming a loose circular pattern. Not scratches, not footprints, more like pressure points, as if something had rested there briefly before lifting away. The pattern didn't photograph well. Angles distorted it. Light erased it. Within hours, it was dismissed as an illusion created by refraction and expectation. By morning, the pool was refilled. The sergeant was informed. He didn't react. But later, alone in his room, he ran his fingers along the inside of his palm as if tracing something invisible, as if confirming that a shape he remembered no longer fit there. Sleep came in fragments. When he did drift off, he dreamed of standing in water that wasn't wet, of being suspended, not submerged, of looking down and seeing the pool far below him, impossibly distant, like a reflection rather than a location. In the dream, he wasn't alone. Something else occupied the space with him. Not beside him, not above him, but around him. A presence defined not by form, but by focus, as if he were the center of an inspection. When he woke, his heart was steady, too steady. Over the next few days, small inconsistencies began to surface. The sergeant's perception of time drifted. He arrived early for events that hadn't been scheduled yet, finished tasks before instructions were issued, corrected people mid-sentence as if anticipating their words. Once, during a routine check, he paused and looked directly at a security camera, not suspiciously, curiously, as if wondering whether it could see him. Someone noticed. Later, that person would say the sergeant's gaze didn't feel confrontational. It felt reciprocal, like eye contact. When asked how he was feeling, the sergeant offered the same response every time. "Aligned," he said. No elaboration, no explanation, just that word. Aligned. And though nothing else overtly changed, no alarms, no new sightings, no confirmations, there was a growing sense that whatever had passed overhead that night had not simply been observed. It had completed something, and the sergeant, whether by chance or design, had been part of that process. Not taken, not altered, just repositioned, as if placed back into the world at a slightly different angle. And the longer he stayed, the more people wondered the same quiet, unrecorded question. If something had looked down from the sky, had it also looked back? In places built on hierarchy, silence is rarely accidental. It is taught, practiced, maintained like equipment. After the incident, the compound didn't issue explanations. It issued adjustments. Schedules tightened. Movement paths shifted subtly. Conversations shortened themselves without being told to. No one announced that the night was over. They simply behaved as if it were. The sergeant noticed this immediately, not because he was paranoid, but because he felt slightly out of phase with everyone else, like a watch set a few seconds ahead, ticking just early enough to be noticeable if you listened closely. He followed orders precisely, more precisely than before, anticipated instructions before they were spoken, completed routines with an efficiency that unsettled rather than impressed. People began avoiding extended interactions with him, not out of fear, out of discomfort. There's a difference. Fear makes you watch. Discomfort makes you look away. One account describes a moment in a common area where conversation died as soon as the sergeant entered. Not abruptly, just gradually, like a radio losing signal. No one acknowledged the shift. No one commented on it later. The sergeant took a seat anyway. He didn't react. He never did. He listened. That was another change people struggled to articulate. He didn't just hear words. He seemed to register what came before them, the hesitation, the breath, the intent forming before sound. Someone once joked, quietly, that it felt like talking to him was like answering questions you hadn't been asked yet. The joke didn't spread. Jokes require shared comfort. During a routine check-in, a superior asked him a question that had been carefully rehearsed. "Do you feel different since the incident?" The sergeant paused. "Yes," he said. That was all. No qualifiers. No defense. Just yes. And is that concerning to you? The sergeant considered this longer. No, he said, but it should be measured. That phrasing unsettled the room. Measured by whom? By what? The question wasn't asked. Instead, the conversation pivoted. Paperwork, protocol, procedure, containment through normalcy. Later that same day, something small happened, small enough to almost go unnoticed. The sergeant adjusted a piece of equipment that no one had flagged as misaligned. Just a fraction of a turn, barely visible. Hours later, a minor failure that should have occurred didn't. No alarms sounded, no reports were filed, only a quiet absence of error. Some believe this was coincidence. Others suggest it was the first observable effect of whatever had shifted inside him. The sergeant didn't claim credit. He didn't even acknowledge the correction. But that night, while walking past the pool, the same pool, now calm and full again, he stopped. The water reflected the sky perfectly. For a moment, he felt that familiar pressure. Not downward, inward. As if something was checking its work. He placed a hand on the railing and said something quietly. So quietly that only one person nearby thought they heard it. "It fits," he said. The person didn't ask what he meant. Because by then, asking questions had begun to feel like a violation. The compound existed in a state of heightened restraint. Not alertness, restraint. As if everyone sensed that drawing attention to the wrong detail might invite something back. The sergeant became the focal point of this restraint without ever being named as such. He wasn't isolated, but he wasn't engaged either. He moved through the space like an object that had been returned to a shelf. Not broken, not damaged, just carefully placed. At night, the sky remained empty, or at least it appeared that way. No more sightings were reported. No metallic reflections. No unnatural stillness. And yet, those who worked the late hours began avoiding looking up. Not out of fear of seeing something, out of fear of being seen, because the sense that lingered after that night wasn't one of threat. It was one of evaluation, as if the event hadn't been an intrusion, but a check. And the sergeant, found unconscious in water he claimed he'd never entered, had been part of the process. Not a victim, not a witness, a reference point. And the silence surrounding him wasn't meant to protect the truth. It was meant to preserve alignment. Silence, when maintained long enough, begins to shape behavior. People stopped asking questions, not because they were ordered to, but because curiosity started to feel misplaced. Like touching something fragile that hadn't asked to be handled. The sergeant became the quiet measure against which everything else was compared. Not officially, not in writing, only in posture, tone, and timing. Those who worked near him began adjusting themselves unconsciously, standing a little straighter, speaking a little slower, pausing before acting, as if some internal signal warned them to reconsider. No one admitted this aloud, but patterns emerged. During briefings, people found themselves waiting an extra beat before speaking, as though expecting the sergeant to interject, even when he didn't. When he did speak, it wasn't disruptive. It was clarifying. He pointed out inconsistencies without accusation, gaps without blame. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. What disturbed people most was that he seemed unaffected by the unease around him, not indifferent, balanced, as if the pressure that unsettled everyone else had already settled into him and found a place to rest. One night, a guard on late rotation reported a sensation while standing watch near the outer perimeter. Not fear, not alarm, just the feeling of being counted, like someone silently verifying a list. The guard didn't file a report. He mentioned it casually the next morning, then stopped mid-sentence and changed the subject. Others began sharing similar fragments. Never in groups, never formally, just one-on-one, spoken quietly, and then abandoned. A hum that wasn't sound, a light that didn't illuminate. A sense of order tightening around them. The sergeant listened when these fragments reached him. He didn't react. But once, only once, he responded. "That's consistent," he said. The person who heard this later said the phrase carried no reassurance, No warning either, just acknowledgement. That same week, a routine systems check flagged a discrepancy. Minor, theoretical, easily dismissed. A fluctuation in something that didn't exist on any meaningful scale. The sergeant reviewed it. He frowned, not in confusion, but in concentration. Then he adjusted the report. Not falsified it, reframed it. Delay, he wrote. Not deviation. No one questioned the wording. Later, someone would realize the distinction mattered. A deviation implies error. A delay implies intention. At night, the sergeant's dreams changed. Not in content, but in orientation. He no longer dreamed of being observed. He dreamed of observing, of looking at structures not from the outside, but from a vantage point that made walls irrelevant, of seeing people as patterns of motion rather than bodies. He didn't wake afraid. He woke precise. During one late shift, he stood alone near the pool again. The water was still. He watched his reflection, not his face, but the shape beneath it, the way the surface bent around him. He placed his hand into the water. Not quickly, not hesitantly. The ripples expanded outward in perfect circles. For a moment, just a moment, he felt something respond, not in the water itself, but in the air above it. A subtle change in pressure, a quiet recalibration. He withdrew his hand, satisfied. From that night on, the sergeant stopped being mentioned entirely. Not because he left, because he blended. He became part of the background of order, a stabilizing constant. Someone whose presence meant fewer corrections were needed elsewhere. The compound functioned better, not faster, better. Mistakes decreased. Conflicts softened before escalating. Decisions aligned more often than chance could explain. And yet, a strange tension lingered. Because if things were improving, then what, exactly, had been introduced? Some believe the object in the sky was never meant to be seen. Others believe it allowed itself to be seen, briefly, as a byproduct of something else. A calibration, an adjustment. A test of how systems respond when something impossible brushes against them lightly. If that's true, then the sergeant's role becomes harder to define. He wasn't chosen. He wasn't taken. He was useful. And usefulness in this context carries a different weight. It suggests continuation, not conclusion. As the weeks passed, the sky remained empty, but no one trusted its emptiness anymore, because absence, they had learned, could be a form of presence. And whatever had once reflected light in that sky, whatever had hovered without sound or urgency, had left behind something far more enduring than proof. It had left alignment. And alignment, once achieved, doesn't announce itself. It simply waits. There's a point where silence stops feeling like protection and starts feeling like instruction. The sergeant sensed that shift before anyone else named it, even internally. Not because he had special insight, but because whatever had passed through him that night had altered the way absence registered. Silence no longer felt empty. It felt shaped, intentional. He continued his duties without deviation. No requests for reassignment. No signs of distress. On paper, he was exemplary. In person, he was calibrated. People stopped checking on him. Not out of neglect. Out of a quiet understanding that checking would be intrusive. When new personnel rotated through the compound, they noticed him immediately, though they couldn't explain why. He didn't dominate rooms. Didn't assert authority beyond what his rank allowed. He simply occupied space with a precision that made others subtly adjust around him. One recruit later described it like this. It felt like standing next to a measuring tool. You didn't feel judged. You felt compared. The sergeant never looked at the sky anymore. That detail stands out because everyone else did. Not openly, not obviously. Just quick glances, brief pauses, a habit of scanning upward when they thought no one was watching. The sergeant didn't. His gaze stayed level, forward, grounded. Someone finally asked him why. The question came late one night, spoken too casually to be safe. "Doesn't it bother you?" the person said. Not knowing if it'll happen again, the sergeant took his time answering. "It already did," he said. The person laughed, uncertain. "I meant the object." The sergeant shook his head. That wasn't the event. That answer didn't spread. People stopped repeating it the way they stopped repeating things that felt dangerous to hold. From then on, subtle differences accumulated. The sergeant reacted to alerts before they triggered. He repositioned personnel without explanation, and the repositioning always made sense later. Not dramatically, just enough to prevent friction. Delay escalation, avoid overlap. He never claimed foresight. When asked how he knew, he replied, "The pattern leaned." That phrase appeared in no manual. At one point, during a scheduled inspection, a superior reviewed footage from multiple cameras. Nothing unusual appeared until the footage was slowed. In several frames, the sergeant paused mid-step. Not frozen, not glitched. Just waiting, as if allowing something unseen to pass through the space before continuing. The footage was dismissed as compression error. The superior didn't mention it again. The sergeant began keeping fewer personal effects. His quarters were almost empty. Not sterile, just complete. Nothing unnecessary. Nothing sentimental. When asked if he planned to take leave, he answered honestly, "I don't think that applies anymore." No one pressed him on what that meant. There was another change, one that unsettled those closest to him. He stopped asking questions. Not because he didn't care, because questions imply uncertainty, and uncertainty for him had resolved into something else. He didn't know more. He knew when to act, when to wait, when to let a situation correct itself without interference. This made him reliable. It also made him alien. One night, the pool lights turned on by themselves. No alarms followed, no errors registered. The lights simply activated, illuminating still water in an otherwise dark compound. The sergeant arrived at the pool moments later. No one knew how he knew. He stood at the edge, hands behind his back, posture exact. He looked into the water, not at his reflection, but through it. Then he nodded. The lights shut off. No one spoke about it. But from that point on, people avoided the pool entirely, not because they feared what had happened there, but because they sensed it was no longer empty. And the sergeant, found once in that water, unconscious and altered, had become its quiet boundary. Not guarding it, understanding it, and somewhere beyond the compound, beyond restricted airspace and controlled routines, something remained aware that the adjustment had held. For now, the shift wasn't announced. It never is. It appeared first in the way people began to doubt their own instincts around him. A conversation would start confidently, then slow as soon as the sergeant entered the room. Not because he interrupted, he rarely did, but because people felt an urge to recalibrate what they were about to say. As if certain words once spoken in his presence might carry consequences they couldn't predict. This wasn't authority. Authority demands compliance. This was alignment, and alignment unsettles people more than orders ever could. Someone finally voiced the thought that had been forming quietly for weeks. Not officially, not during a briefing, just a low, private admission spoken in a corridor. "It feels like he's not reacting to things anymore," the person said. "It feels like things are reacting to him." That sentence never made it into any log, but it spread. Not as gossip. Gossip distorts, but as a shared unease that didn't need embellishment. The sergeant continued his routines, ate when scheduled, slept when instructed, completed tasks with precision, but there was an increasing sense that these routines were overlays, not necessities, as if he could function without them, but chose not to. One account describes a night exercise that went subtly wrong. Nothing dramatic, just a sequence that began drifting off its intended rhythm. A misstep here, a delay there. Before anyone issued a correction, the sergeant adjusted his pace. Others followed instinctively. The formation stabilized. Later, when reviewing the exercise, someone pointed out the moment where things should have failed. They rewound the footage. At the exact second the deviation began, the sergeant had turned his head slightly, not toward the error, toward the sky. That detail made several people uncomfortable, because the sergeant had made a point of not looking up anymore. Except then. When asked about it afterward, he said, "I wasn't looking at the sky." "Then where were you looking?" someone asked. He thought for a moment. At the boundary, he replied. No one asked which boundary. There was another incident, minor but persistent in retelling. A system alert triggered briefly, then resolved itself before protocols engaged. The log showed a correction had been applied seconds before the alert registered. The sergeant had been in the area. He hadn't touched anything. He hadn't needed to. Someone suggested coincidence. Someone else suggested the system had learned. The sergeant listened to these conversations without comment. But later, alone, he wrote something in a personal notebook, if the notebook existed at all. The fragment attributed to it reads, "Integration does not announce itself. It simply reduces resistance." That line frightened people when they heard it secondhand, not because it sounded alien, but because it sounded efficient. Over time, the compound's unease crystallized into a single unspoken question. Had the sergeant been changed by the event? Or had the event found something already compatible? That distinction mattered, because if the phenomenon had altered him, it was an anomaly, contained, isolated, manageable. But if it had recognized something in him, then the encounter wasn't random. It was selective. The sergeant began spending more time near thresholds, doorways, gates, the edges of monitored zones, places where one state becomes another. He never crossed without reason, but he lingered, observing transitions. One night, someone asked him directly, too directly, "What are you now?" The question came out harsher than intended. The sergeant didn't take offense. He answered calmly, "I'm where I'm supposed to be." "That's not an answer," the person said. The sergeant considered this. "Neither was the question," he replied. After that, no one asked him anything personal again. The sky remained empty, or appeared to. But emptiness had lost its meaning, because now everyone understood something they hadn't before. Absence could be active. Silence could be operational. And the sergeant, once found unconscious in a pool beneath an unexplained object, had become the quiet proof of that idea. Not a messenger, not a warning. A calibration point. Something the system now oriented itself around. And systems don't do that accidentally. They do it when something fits too well to ignore. At some point, people stopped waiting for the sky. That change was subtle, but decisive. The early days after the incident were marked by expectation, by the sense that whatever had appeared might return, that the event was a beginning, rather than an interruption. Eyes lifted more often. Night shifts felt longer. Silence felt provisional. Then that anticipation faded, not because reassurance arrived, because something else took its place: continuity. The compound no longer behaved as if it had been visited. It behaved as if something had stayed, not visibly, not physically, structurally. The sergeant became the clearest expression of this shift, though no one would have admitted it openly. He didn't issue new rules. He didn't enforce anything beyond his authority. And yet, behavior continued to reorganize itself around him. People adjusted routes unconsciously to pass through spaces he had recently occupied. Schedules drifted closer to his rhythm. Decisions aligned more often with his assessments, even when he hadn't voiced them. It wasn't obedience, it was coherence. One person described it later as the feeling that friction had been smoothed out in advance. That sensation was unsettling in a place that valued human judgment. Because judgment requires disagreement, and disagreement requires uncertainty. The sergeant carried neither, not because he knew outcomes, but because he seemed to recognize thresholds. He knew when something was about to tip, and when it wouldn't. During a routine planning session, a proposed adjustment was debated at length. Opinions split. Voices tightened. The discussion threatened to spiral into something inefficient. The sergeant, seated at the far end of the table, hadn't spoken. Then he said one sentence. Delay it. No justification. No argument. Just that. The room paused. And then, almost without noticing, everyone agreed. The adjustment was postponed. Days later, a factor no one had anticipated rendered the entire discussion irrelevant. No one commented on the timing. But the pattern was now undeniable. The sergeant didn't predict events. He arrived at the moment just before prediction would have mattered. Some began to describe him, not to his face, not formally, as a stabilizer, a buffer, someone who absorbed volatility simply by being present. Others found that interpretation deeply uncomfortable, because stabilizers aren't neutral. They are interfaces, and interfaces exist between systems. One night, a minor power fluctuation rippled through part of the compound. Nothing failed. Nothing shut down. Lights dimmed, then returned. The sergeant was already standing at a junction when it happened. He didn't move. He closed his eyes. Those who noticed later said it looked like listening, but not with ears. When the power returned, he opened his eyes and nodded once, as if acknowledging a completed exchange. Later, when asked where he had been during the fluctuation, he answered truthfully. "Here," he said. The person asking hesitated. "I meant, what were you doing?" The sergeant thought for a moment. "Allowing it," he replied. That word spread quietly. Allowing. Not fixing, not stopping, not preventing. Allowing. As if the event needed permission more than resistance. People began to wonder whether the phenomenon in the sky had ever truly left, or whether it had transitioned from observation to integration. The absence of further sightings didn't reassure anyone anymore. It felt deliberate, as if the system no longer required an external check, because something internal had been installed. The sergeant didn't change physically. He aged normally, slept, ate, followed protocol. But something about his presence flattened emotional spikes around him. Panic diminished. Urgency softened. Crises lost their edge. That should have been a good thing. Instead, it made people uneasy, because urgency is human, and the absence of it felt curated. One night, standing alone near the outer perimeter, the sergeant looked up for the first time in weeks. The sky was empty. No reflection, no anomaly, just darkness. He didn't search it. He acknowledged it. Then he looked back down at the compound and whispered something that no one else heard, but which several later claimed they felt. "It's holding," whatever that meant, whatever it was. From that point on, the question no one dared ask grew heavier. If the presence no longer needed to arrive, then what had it become? And what exactly was the sergeant now maintaining? Control rarely announces itself. When it does, it's easy to resist. What unsettled the compound most was that nothing felt imposed anymore. No new rules, no visible oversight, no pressure from above or beyond. Everything continued exactly as it should, only smoother, quieter, more efficient than anyone remembered it being. And that was the problem. The sergeant became less noticeable, the more central he became. People stopped tracking his movements consciously, yet somehow always knew where he was. Not because he was watched, but because things behaved differently in his absence. Minor conflicts flared when he wasn't nearby. Small inefficiencies multiplied. Conversations grew sharper at the edges. Then he would reappear, and the sharpness dulled. Someone described it later as the air settling. This didn't feel like leadership. It felt like environmental regulation. A few individuals began experiencing something difficult to articulate. Not fear, not paranoia, a subtle reluctance to act independently. Decisions felt heavier when made away from the sergeant's presence, lighter when aligned with it. That realization frightened them, because it suggested that choice itself was being optimized. One person tried to push back against this feeling, deliberately acted against the sergeant's quiet suggestions, took an alternate route, reordered priorities. Nothing catastrophic happened, but everything became harder. Processes stalled, misunderstandings multiplied, a sense of friction returned. Not dramatic, but exhausting. By the end of the day, the person found themselves gravitating back toward the sergeant's rhythm, without consciously deciding to. No one spoke of this aloud. Admitting it would have meant admitting dependence, and dependence was something they had been trained to eliminate. The sergeant himself showed no signs of satisfaction. If anything, he seemed constrained. He moved less, spoke less. His posture carried a subtle tension now, like something holding him in place rather than freeing him. Those closest to him sensed that whatever role he occupied wasn't chosen, it was sustained. Late one evening, during a lull, when even the hum of systems felt distant, Someone asked him a question that had no procedural value. "Do you feel in control?" the person asked. The sergeant didn't answer immediately. "I don't feel," he said finally. "I maintain." That answer landed heavily. Maintain what? The sergeant's gaze shifted. Not upward, not outward, but inward. "Continuity," he replied. The word echoed. Continuity implies preservation, but also stagnation. The idea that nothing breaks, because nothing is allowed to change too quickly. After that exchange, the sergeant requested time alone near the pool. The request was granted without discussion. He stood at the water's edge for a long time, watching the surface absorb light and give nothing back. Those who passed nearby felt an unspoken pressure not to interrupt, as if something delicate was in progress. Later, much later, he was seen stepping back from the pool, shoulders lowered slightly, like someone who had finished holding a weight. From that night on, the compound's atmosphere shifted again. Not dramatically, just enough. The sergeant stopped preempting events, allowed small errors to occur, let conversations drift without correction. Friction returned, but so did spontaneity. People felt relief they didn't know they'd been missing. Someone asked him why he'd changed. He answered simply, "Balance requires variance." No one knew whether that was a lesson learned or one delivered. The sky remained empty, but emptiness no longer felt like a test. It felt like an outcome, as if something had checked its work, confirmed stability, and stepped back. Not vanished, but disengaged. And the sergeant? He remained human again, in ways that mattered. Still precise, still quiet, but no longer the axis around which everything turned. Whatever had passed through him had loosened its hold. Or perhaps, more unsettlingly, he had loosened his. Because the most dangerous form of control isn't force. It's harmony without consent. And the moment the sergeant allowed the system to feel imperfect again, he may have done something no one noticed at the time. He may have ended the observation. Or he may have proven something far more valuable. That humans, left slightly misaligned, still choose their own direction. And that whatever once hovered in the sky didn't need to stay to know the result. The moment didn't arrive with lights or sound. There was no return to the sky. No reflection. No metallic shape testing the limits of visibility. If anything, the absence felt intentional, like an audience that had chosen not to attend. That in itself felt like a signal. The compound entered a phase no one had planned for. Autonomy, not declared, not celebrated, just present. Systems functioned. People argued again. Minor failures occurred and were corrected by human hands instead of anticipation. Decisions regained their rough edges. It wasn't chaos. It was texture. The sergeant noticed immediately, not with alarm, with recognition. He moved differently now, less centered, more mobile. He no longer lingered at thresholds, no longer paused before transitions. He crossed them like everyone else, imperfectly, and that imperfection mattered. It meant the balance had shifted back. One evening, during a routine that felt almost forgettable, a discrepancy surfaced. Small, localized, the kind that used to resolve itself before anyone noticed. This time it didn't. A choice had to be made. Not by committee, not by protocol alone. A human judgment was required, one that carried consequences no system could absorb quietly. The sergeant was the most experienced person present. Eyes turned to him without instruction. For the first time in a long while, he didn't respond immediately. He felt the old pressure rise. Faint, familiar, tempting. The sense that he could step into the space where outcomes collapsed into alignment. That he could smooth the moment, reduce friction, preserve continuity. He didn't. Instead, he asked a question. "What do you see?" He said. The room hesitated. People weren't used to being asked that by him. They answered anyway, tentatively at first, then more clearly. Perspectives differed. Risks were named. Disagreements surfaced. Time passed. The sergeant listened. He felt the pull again. Not from above, not from outside, but from within. The habit of being the quiet solution. the stabilizer, the interface. And for the first time, he recognized it as a choice, not an obligation, not a function, a choice. When the decision was finally made, it wasn't optimal. It wasn't elegant. It carried risk. It carried accountability. It was human. The sergeant nodded once. "Proceed," he said. The outcome wasn't perfect, but it held. Later, alone, the sergeant stood near the pool one last time. The water was calm, reflecting nothing unusual. Just stars. Ordinary, distant, unconcerned. He didn't feel watched. He didn't feel aligned. He felt present. And that presence came with something he hadn't experienced since before the incident. Uncertainty. It didn't frighten him. It grounded him. He understood then that whatever had happened that night, the object, the pressure, the alignment, it had offered a shortcut, a way to reduce complexity, to make systems cleaner, quieter, less human, useful, dangerous. By stepping away from that shortcut, he wasn't rejecting what had occurred. He was completing it. Because observation only matters if the subject is free to choose differently afterward. And tonight, no one was watching. That realization settled over him like a release. Not relief. Permission. Nothing followed. That was the most unsettling part. No response from the sky. No anomaly in the air. No sense of recalibration pressing inward or outward. The compound continued functioning. Not better, not worse. Simply human. The sergeant expected something. Not consciously, not dramatically. Just a residual instinct that consequence must announce itself. That a decision of that weight should trigger a reaction. It didn't. Days passed, then weeks. The routines remained imperfect. Errors occurred and were corrected too late, or too early, or in ways that sparked debate. People disagreed again. Voices rose. Egos surfaced. Nothing broke irreversibly. The sergeant felt something unfamiliar grow inside him. Relief wasn't the right word. It was relief's quieter cousin. Trust. Not in systems, not in oversight. In variance. He realized how narrow his world had become when alignment ruled everything. How little space there had been for chance, disagreement, inefficiency. The very things that allowed choice to exist. One night, long after the incident had stopped being mentioned even in whispers, the sergeant stood on the perimeter and looked up. Not searching, acknowledging. The sky offered nothing back. No reflection, no pressure, no sense of presence. Just depth. He found that acceptable. Later, during an informal exchange that might never have happened at all, someone asked him a question that would have been unthinkable months earlier. "Do you think it's over?" The sergeant didn't answer right away. "Over implies conclusion," he said eventually. "This wasn't a story like that." "So, what was it?" the person asked. He considered several answers, then chose the simplest. "A test," he said. "Not of readiness, of restraint." The person frowned. "Did we pass?" The sergeant looked back toward the compound, toward the uneven rhythm of lights, movement, noise, toward arguments unfolding and resolving without silent correction. "Yes," he said, "because we stopped trying to." That answer stayed with the person who heard it. Years later, when telling the story, they would emphasize this part, that the phenomenon didn't demand belief, loyalty, or submission. It demanded nothing at all. It observed. And then it waited to see what happened when observation ended. The sergeant never claimed certainty about what the object was, or where it came from, or whether it had truly been singular. He didn't speculate publicly. He didn't theorize. He lived, quietly, deliberately, with margin. The pool remained in use. Occasionally, people swam in it again, laughed near it, treated it like water instead of memory. The sergeant avoided it, not out of fear, but out of respect. Some places don't need revisiting. As time passed, the story thinned. Details blurred, timelines softened. The metallic object became a suggestion rather than a shape. The unconscious body in the pool became a rumor rather than a fact. Only one thing stayed consistent across every version. The sergeant had been changed, not upgraded, not enhanced, returned. Returned to a state where choice mattered again. And somewhere, If one believes in such things, whatever had hovered in the sky that night learned what it needed to learn, not about technology, not about defenses, not about power, but about refusal, about the moment a system is offered perfect alignment and chooses imperfection instead. Not because it's safer, but because it's alive. And if the sky ever does fill again, if another object ever reflects light in a way that feels too deliberate, some believe it won't be there to correct anything. It will be there to check one thing only, whether the choice still exists. This story doesn't end with answers. It ends with space. A sky that offers nothing back, a system that stumbles and recovers on its own. A man who once carried alignment and chose to set it down. If something observed that night, it didn't leave behind proof. It left behind a question. Not what are you capable of, but what will you give up to be efficient? Because perfect order is tempting, silent, clean, and dangerously easy to accept. The sergeant was found once in water he claimed he never entered. After that, he learned something most systems never do. That control without choice isn't stability. It's suspension. And the moment he chose uncertainty over alignment, something far more important than safety returned. Agency. Whether the object was real, imagined, or something in between, will never be resolved. And that may be the point, because the most important thing didn't arrive from the sky. It happened afterward, when no one was watching, when the silence lifted, and a human decision, imperfect, risky, and unobserved, was allowed to stand.